There are moments when paradise turns into hell in the blink of an eye. In the Algarve in August 2007, that transformation took exactly 47 minutes and opened a wound that would remain open for 16 years. The Harper family landed in Faro on a suffocatingly hot afternoon. Emma held Sophie's hand tightly while Daniel carried the bags, laughing at something the little girl had said on the plane. Sophie, at 4 years old, had blonde hair that shone under the Portuguese sun, curious blue eyes, and a habit of squeezing the ears of stuffed animals when she was sleepy. It was their first time traveling outside of England, and every detail seemed magical. The palm trees, the smell of the sea, the white houses that contrasted with the impossible blue of the sky. The chosen resort was modest but welcoming. Situated on a hill with a view of the ocean, it offered a pool, a restaurant, and rooms arranged in small separate blocks. Emma had researched for months, read dozens of reviews, and made sure it was safe for children. Deep down, she knew she would never forgive herself if something happened under her responsibility. But she also knew that at some point she would have to trust that the world outside wasn't as dangerous as her fears. Daniel joked that she seemed to be planning a military operation, not a family vacation. She smiled, but the instinctive worry remained. For the first 3 days, everything went as advertised in the agency brochures: nearly deserted beaches. At dawn, sandcastles destroyed by childish laughter, ice cream melting before the last lick. At night, while their daughter slept, Emma and Daniel would sit on the small balcony of their room, sharing a bottle of wine and plans for the future. Maybe more children, maybe a bigger house. Maybe returning to the Algarve every year, creating a family tradition. On the 5th night, they decided to have dinner at the complex's restaurant. Sophie had fallen asleep early, exhausted from a day at the beach. The room was just 20 meters from the restaurant, with the window visible from the table where they sat. Emma checked 3 times that the door was locked, that the baby monitor was working, that there were enough blankets. Daniel said she was overreacting, but he was kind about it. They agreed to take turns. One would stay at the table, while the other checked on Sophie every 15 minutes. For the first hour, everything went according to plan. Daniel returned from the first check saying the little one was on her side, hugging the stuffed rabbit she took everywhere. Emma did the second check 20 minutes later. Her daughter had moved but was sleeping soundly. They ordered more wine, allowing themselves to relax. Other couples in the restaurant were doing the same, in a quiet and seemingly safe routine. At 9:47 p.m., Emma got up for the third check. It was the last time that night seemed normal. Daniel was finishing his dessert when he heard the scream. It wasn't just any scream. It was the sound of something breaking inside someone. He ran. The room door was ajar, swinging slightly in the night breeze. The lock hadn't been forced, but it also wasn't locked, as Emma swore she had left it. The window, which overlooked the side garden, was open. The curtains danced inward. Sophie wasn't in bed. She wasn't in the bathroom. She wasn't under the bed where she sometimes played hide-and-seek. The stuffed rabbit was on the floor, near the window, its ear still crumpled by the small fingers that had held it for the last time. Emma started screaming. Her daughter's name first inside the room, then in the hallway, then running barefoot through the resort. Daniel tried to stay calm, checking closets, calling reception, asking them to check the pool, the playground, anywhere a child might have gone. Within 15 minutes, the entire complex was awake. Guests came out of their rooms in robes, employees left their work to search, and the manager called the local police. Among the first to offer help was João Costa, a local businessman staying with his family, who quickly became a sort of informal coordinator for the searches, organizing groups and handing out flashlights. Emma entered a state that oscillated between absolute panic and complete denial. Daniel tried to organize her, to remind her of details, what the girl was wearing, if there had been anything unusual in the previous days, if anyone had shown excessive interest in the child. Emma could only repeat, "She was here. I checked. She was here." When Inspector Miguel Azevedo arrived, half an hour after the initial call, he found a scene of organized chaos. At 28, Miguel was too young to lead serious cases, but he was the only inspector available that night. Tall, thin, with dark eyes that always seemed worried, he tried to impose order. He asked for the room area to be cordoned off, for the guests to return to their rooms, for no one to touch anything. But it was already too late. No one was wearing gloves. Doors were opened and closed, curtains were pulled. Glasses were removed from the room. Every well-intentioned gesture erased a little more of any chance to reconstruct, with precision, what had happened there. Dozens of people had walked through the garden, the hallway, the room. Footprints mixed together. Potential evidence had been trampled by well-intentioned shoes. There was no clear perimeter. There was no immediate collection of fingerprints. There was only goodwill. And goodwill doesn't solve crimes. Miguel interviewed Emma and Daniel separately. Both told the same story, without contradictions. He observed the genuine pain on their faces, the confusion, the desperation. There were no signs of violence between them, no history of neglect, no reason to suspect. But he knew that, statistically, the parents were always the first suspects, and he also knew that, from that moment on, any mistake he made could condemn the innocent or let a guilty person go free. It was a kind of weight the academy doesn't teach you to carry. At 3 in the morning, reinforcements arrived. Sniffer dogs were released throughout the resort and adjacent areas. One of them stopped at the open window, then followed a trail to the parking lot, where it lost the scent. The most likely theory began to form. Someone had entered through the window, taken the child, and left by car. But who? And why? And how did they know that specific room had a little girl alone? At dawn, without Sophie, without suspects, and with a destroyed family, Miguel sat, alone in the resort's garden, and lit a cigarette. He hadn't smoked in 2 years. The sun rose beautifully over the Algarve, painting the sky pink and orange, indifferent to the horror that had happened during the night. He knew the next few hours would be crucial. He knew every minute counted, and he knew deep down that they had already made mistakes that could cost everything. And you? Have you ever imagined losing someone you love in a place that promised to be safe? This story, inspired by real cases of failed investigations that were solved years later, will take you through every mistake, every ignored clue, and every twist of one of the most disturbing cases in the Algarve. If you want to understand how 47 minutes of carelessness turned into a 16-year search, and how the main suspect ended up shocking the entire community, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There are things you need to hear before your next family trip. In 47 minutes, Sophie Harper disappeared from a locked room in the Algarve. The open window, the stuffed rabbit on the floor, and the parents' despair turned a summer vacation into a nightmare without end. In 47 minutes, Sophie Harper disappeared from a locked room in the Algarve. In the next 48 hours, the case that could have been solved began to be lost. The first 48 hours of any disappearance are crucial. Statistics show that if a child is not found in that period, the chances of survival plummet. Miguel Azevedo knew this. Emma and Daniel did too, and everyone, in different ways, carried the weight of this knowledge as time slipped through their fingers. Day 2. The morning after the disappearance. The resort was transformed into an operations center. Judicial police vehicles blocked the accesses, journalists descended from rented cars with microphones in hand, coming from Lisbon and Porto. Cameras were pointed at any movement, especially at Emma and Daniel. The Harpers were installed in an administrative room, away from their own room, now sealed as a crime scene. Emma was trembling so much she had to hold her coffee cup with both hands, and even then the liquid shook. Daniel paced back and forth, wearing out the same patch of carpet while calling England, repeating the same phrase to each family member. "We've lost Sophie." Miguel coordinated the searches with a team that grew by the hour. Helicopters flew over the region. Divers inspected nearby beaches and wells, and volunteers combed through woods and abandoned lots. Among those helping Miguel review statements was an English guest who had offered himself as a volunteer translator. No one had a reason to suspect him at that point. Sophie's photograph, the UR, one taken 3 days earlier at the beach, with her smile lit by the sun, was already circulating throughout Europe. Blonde hair, blue eyes, 4 years old. She was wearing pink pajamas with a star print when she disappeared. But physical clues were almost non-existent. The forensic team found fabric, fibers on the window, possibly from gloves. There were faint marks on the outer windowsill, suggesting someone had rested their hands there, but no usable fingerprints. The side garden, of packed earth and low grass, should have had clear footprints, but dozens of people had walked there during the night search. What could have been a direct trail from the criminal became a tangled mess of overlapping tracks, impossible to decipher. First mistake, not immediately securing the scene. Second mistake, allowing an unorganized volunteer search before the forensics team arrived. In the parking lot, the sniffer dogs indicated 2 different spaces, both empty the next morning. Miguel ordered a check on all license plates registered at the resort's entrance in the last 72 hours. There were 48 vehicles. Each owner was located and interviewed. None raised concrete suspicions. Most were tourists, couples with children, retirees, fragile alibis, but nothing that pointed to a planned kidnapping. Day 3. The pressure and the first clue. The pressure on Miguel was mounting. Superiors demanded results. The English media turned the case into a front-page headline. Tabloids spoke of human trafficking, pedophilia, conspiracy, incompetence. That was the word that began to circulate. Every hour without an answer fed the sense of collective failure. And then the first concrete clue emerged, or what seemed to be one. A cleaning staff member named Rui said that on the night of the disappearance, he had seen a man standing near the block of rooms where the Harpers were staying. He couldn't describe the face, but he remembered the posture. Someone observing, motionless, as if waiting. Rui hadn't thought much of it at the time. He thought it was a guest smoking. But now, recalling it, it seemed strange, suspicious. Miguel dug deeper. He asked for a physical description, medium height, maybe 1.75 meters, dark clothes, possibly a cap. Rui wasn't sure of anything. Memory is treacherous, especially under pressure. Still, a composite sketch was created, it was released, and it generated hundreds of calls from people who recognized the suspect. None led anywhere. It was Miguel's first experience with a type of frustration that would be repeated many times in that case. Leads that started promisingly and died in silence. In parallel, the investigation began to do what it always does in such cases: look inward. Emma and Daniel were questioned repeatedly, not as formal suspects, but with the insistence of someone looking for inconsistencies, details about the couple's relationship, financial history, Sophie's behavior in the preceding days. Had there been arguments? Did anyone threaten them? Did the girl show fear of any specific person? The answers were always the same. No, no, no. But the statistics insisted on something Miguel hated to admit. Most crimes against children happen within the family circle. Parents lie, appearances deceive. So he pressed. He asked for permission to search the Harpers' house in England. He checked bank accounts. He investigated whether there were signs of abuse, neglect, anything that would explain the disappearance as something other than a random kidnapping. Nothing was found. On the 3rd day, Emma stopped answering questions and began to respond only to her own panic. She screamed that she needed to go back to the room, that Sophie would be there, that it was all a mistake. She had to be sedated, taken to the local hospital, where she spent the night under observation. Daniel, who until then had been the strong one in the family, broke down. He cried as he had never cried in his life, clinging to a police officer who didn't speak English but perfectly understood the universal language of despair. Day 4, the second clue and the most painful mistake. Meanwhile, the second clue emerged, and this one, and was disturbing. A German tourist who had been staying at the resort the week before the disappearance called the police. She said she had noticed a man photographing children in the pool area. She found it strange, but didn't report it. Now, seeing Sophie's face on the news, she felt a guilt that wouldn't let her sleep. She kept repeating the same phrase in her head: I should have said something. She described the man, in his 50s, graying hair, an accent she couldn't identify. He wasn't staying at the resort, at least not officially. He would show up, stay for a few hours, and leave. Miguel tried to locate this man through the complex's security cameras, and then came another critical error in the investigation, perhaps the most painful one yet. The recordings were only stored for 72 hours. After that, they were automatically deleted to save space. The man described by the German, by the I, tourist had been there a week earlier. If someone had requested those images on the day of the disappearance, they would still be there. The images no longer existed. It was like being punched in the stomach. Potential evidence, lost due to a negligent administrative procedure. Miguel wanted to scream, to break something, but he just clenched his fists and moved on. There was no time to regret mistakes. There was only time to try not to make new ones. Day 5. The turn in the searches. The active searches began to wind down, not out of surrender but out of cruel realism. Hundreds of square kilometers had been searched. No body, no clothes, no sign of Sophie Harper. The dominant theory shifted to human trafficking. An organized network that had observed the family, identified the pattern, parents dining, child alone, acted quickly, and disappeared. The girl might already be out of Portugal, possibly in Spain, Morocco, or some basement in Eastern Europe. This theory, cold, statistical, horrible, was presented to Emma and Daniel by a psychologist assigned to prepare them. They didn't accept it. They couldn't accept it. As long as there was doubt, there was hope, and hope was the only thing keeping them alive. Miguel, alone in the improvised office, reviewed every document, every statement, every photograph from the crime scene. He was looking for the detail that had been missed, the connection everyone had lost, the loose thread that, when pulled, would unravel everything. But there was no thread. Or if there was, it was buried under layers of mistakes, evidence contamination, and lost time. He lit another cigarette. He looked at Sophie's photo on the wall, and he made a silent promise. No matter how long it took, he would find out the truth. What Miguel didn't know was that it would take 16 years, and that the truth was closer than anyone imagined. In the next moments, the parents shift from victims to being in the police's crosshairs. The press turns the case into a circus, and a key witness appears with information that changes everything. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss the most controversial part of this investigation. 5 days had passed since Sophie Harper's disappearance. The searchers had found nothing. The leads had died before leading anywhere. And the investigation, with no apparent way forward, began to turn inward, directly on Emma and Daniel. 5 days had passed since Sophie Harper's disappearance. The searchers had found nothing. The leads had died before leading anywhere. When there's nowhere else to go on the outside, the investigation does what it always does. It turns inward. And this time, it turned directly on Emma and Daniel. The Friday after the disappearance marked a turn that Emma and Daniel never expected. Miguel Azevedo received a call from a former colleague at Scotland Yard, assigned to monitor the case. The conversation was short, technical, and devastating. Statistically, when there are no signs of forced entry, when the child disappears from inside the home, when there are no reliable witnesses, the parents are always the starting point, not out of cruelty, but out of probability. And in this case, some inconsistencies were starting to bother them. Miguel knew that from that moment on, he had to look at Emma and Daniel not just as grieving parents, but as possible suspects. And that ate at him. The first one was simple, but disturbing. Emma claimed to have checked on Sophie for the last time at 10:30 p.m. Daniel confirmed it. But a chambermaid passing through the hallway at 10:45 p.m. swore she heard a child crying from that room. She described an insistent cry, the kind that isn't just a simple fuss. When questioned in more detail, she began to hesitate. It could have come from the next room. It could have been an echo. It could have been her memory playing tricks after days of seeing Sophie's face on television. But the doubt had been planted. If Sophie cried 15 minutes after the supposed last check, why didn't the parents hear her? Or did they hear and not say so? The second inconsistency came from the couple's history. During a routine financial check, the police discovered that Emma had undergone therapy for severe postpartum depression after Sophie's birth. None of this was mentioned in the initial interviews. When confronted, Emma collapsed again. It wasn't just crying. It was an explosion of shame, fear, and anger. She screamed that it had nothing to do with the disappearance, that she loved her daughter more than her own life, that she hid the treatment for fear of being judged, not out of guilt. Daniel defended her fiercely, accusing the police of trying to build a cruel narrative to cover up their own incompetence. Miguel hated this stage of an investigation. He hated seeing destroyed parents being treated as potential criminals. But he knew he couldn't ignore the basic rules of investigative work. Children don't vanish into thin air. Someone knows something. And sometimes that someone is closer than we'd like to admit. So he pushed. He asked for detailed timelines of the night minute by minute. He reviewed every movement, every decision. He repeated the same questions on different days, in different rooms, with different intonations, looking for any contradiction. Why did they leave? Sophie alone. Why didn't they use the babysitting service offered by the resort? Why was the room locked from the inside if the window was open? These questions, asked and re-asked, eroded Emma and Daniel's sanity like slow acid. Each interrogation turned them a little more into hollow versions of themselves. Meanwhile, the British press decided it had a better story than a random kidnapping. Tabloids began to speculate openly. Headlines screamed sordid possibilities: parental negligence, a cover-up, an accident, followed by panic. Mother drank wine while daughter disappeared. Couple argued. Days before the night of the disappearance, the photo of Emma being taken to the hospital, sedated, her arm dangling from the stretcher, became a cover story. She was no longer a mother in shock. She was Sophie's mother, frozen in a frame convenient for any narrative. Daniel's crying at a press conference was dissected by body language experts on television, each gesture interpreted as a sign of guilt or performative despair. One tabloid published an entire article dedicated to the fact that Emma had drunk 2 glasses of wine at dinner. 2 glasses of wine became synonymous with criminal. Irresponsibility, proof that she was impaired, unable to protect her daughter. Another newspaper brought up an argument the couple had in the hotel lobby 2 days before the disappearance. It was about which outing to take the next day, a mundane daily occurrence for any couple on vacation. But in Tuonduedi, the sensationalist pages, it became evidence of an unstable relationship, emotional violence, a toxic environment for a child. The Harper family, who days before had received solidarity from around the world, was now being judged in the court of public opinion. Online groups debated whether Emma was guilty. Entire forums were dedicated to analyzing every available video frame, looking for micro-expressions that would reveal a lie. The public outcry turned into a lynching. And worse, it began to contaminate the real investigation. Miguel realized his team was divided. Some investigators genuinely believed the parents were hiding something. They started referring to Emma and Daniel as they, instead of the parents. Others thought they were chasing the wrong lead, while the real criminal was getting further away. The internal meetings became tense, fraught with frustration and veiled accusations. Each day, without a concrete breakthrough, made everyone more desperate for any narrative that made sense, even if that narrative was unjust. On the 10th day, something changed. A witness appeared. Not someone from the resort, but a man who lived in a village 15 kilometers away. He worked as a taxi driver, and after seeing the case on the news repeatedly, had a nagging memory. In the early hours of the disappearance, around 2 in the morning, he was driving home on a secondary road, almost always deserted at that time. The taxi's headlights cut through the darkness. When he saw a car parked on the shoulder, this wasn't entirely unusual, but something caught his attention. The driver was alone, with the headlights off, looking at the open trunk. When the taxi passed, the man hastily closed the trunk and got into the car. He didn't see a child. He didn't see blood. He didn't see anything that at that moment justified a call to the police. But now, after days of seeing Sophie's face on the news, that scene wouldn't leave his mind. And there was more. He remembered the car's model. A dark sedan, possibly a Renault, with a Portuguese license plate. He couldn't remember the numbers, but the first letter was C. Miguel felt something he hadn't felt in days. Not hope, not yet, but the spark of a real possibility. He cross-referenced the records. There were 3 dark Renaults with license plates starting with C registered in the resort's entry system. In the 5 days before the disappearance, one belonged to an elderly couple, quickly dismissed. Another was from a sales representative who had solid alibis for the night of the crime. The third was registered to a car rental company. And then the lead went cold again. The company reported that the car had been rented by a Spanish tourist, but the contract was incomplete. A fake name, a document never properly verified, payment in cash. The car was returned 3 days after the disappearance, washed, with no recoverable forensic evidence. It was the pattern of that case, always one step behind. Someone who seemed to know exactly how to disappear. But that witness brought something crucial. He brought back the narrative that Sophie had been taken by an outsider. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't parental negligence followed by a cover-up. It was a premeditated crime committed by someone who knew what they were doing. And that finally took Emma and Daniel out of the main focus, at least on paper. The pressure on them didn't disappear completely. Part of the press continued to insist on conspiracy theories. Part of the public would never forgive them for leaving their daughter alone, regardless of criminal guilt. But for the official investigation, the focus returned to where it should have always been, finding the man in the dark car. Miguel knew he had lost precious time chasing the wrong lead. Not out of malice, but out of protocol. And now, with almost 2 weeks past since the disappearance, Sophie Harper could be anywhere in Europe, or worse, no longer anywhere at all. The clock never stopped, and every lost second weighed like lead. In the next block, the investigation crosses borders. An anonymous tip leads the police to a disturbing address, and for the first time, a real possibility emerges that Sophie might be alive. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the most tense part of this story. Emma and Daniel Harper were removed from the main focus of the investigation after a witness emerged who saw a suspicious man with a dark car in the early hours of the disappearance. But almost 2 weeks have passed and Sophie still hasn't been found. The trail has gone cold until an anonymous call changes everything. On the 13th day after Sophie Harper's disappearance, the Portuguese police hotline received a call. It was a male voice, muffled, nervous. There was a hiss in the background as if he were calling from an enclosed space, maybe a basement, maybe a car. I know about a girl. It could be Sophie, he said, stumbling over his words. I can't give my name. Write down the address. He spoke quickly, like someone afraid of being discovered. He gave an address. An isolated house on the outskirts of Faro in southern Portugal, about 200 kilometers from the resort where Sophie was last seen. The call lasted less than 40 seconds. Before the operator could ask any questions, he only heard a dry click. The line was cut. The operator signaled the call tracing protocol, but the time was too short for anything conclusive. Miguel Azevedo received the information minutes later. His first instinct was skepticism. He had seen this movie before. Anonymous tips always popped up whenever a case exploded in the EJ media. Most led to nothing. People seeking attention, opportunists, or simply confusing the face of a missing child with another they saw on a supermarket poster. But there was something about that call that was unsettling. The man didn't ask for money. He didn't try to put himself at the center of the story. He didn't give too many details, as compulsive liars often do. Just an address, a vague description, and an abrupt hang-up. It was little, but it was more than Miguel had had in days. Miguel decided to act. 2 hours later, a discreet operation was mounted. No sirens, no fuss. After a lightning-fast authorization from the public prosecutor's office, the team headed to the address. If Sophie was there, the last thing they needed was to scare the kidnapper and put the child at risk. The team was composed of agents specializing in high-risk rescues, 2 negotiators trained in hostage crises, and a child psychologist in case they needed to deal with a traumatized child. The address was on a dirt road, 15 minutes from the main highway. It was night, and the headlights of the police cars cast long shadows on the olive trees. The house was small, old, with peeling walls and windows covered by thick curtains. There was no exterior light, no sound of a television, no dog in the yard. The kind of place that goes unnoticed, swallowed by the dark and forgotten among olive trees and abandoned lots. The agents surrounded the perimeter in silence. There was a car, parked in front, a dark Renault. Portuguese license plate starting with the letter C. The same pattern as the vehicle seen on the secondary road, the same pattern as the car rented with incomplete documents. Miguel's heart raced. For the first time in almost 2 weeks, they were facing something that seemed like more than a coincidence. The plan was simple. Observe first, confirm internal movement, and only then act. They couldn't risk a hasty entry. If someone was inside with Sophie, any mistake could be fatal. For 40 minutes, nothing happened. No visible movement, no sound. The house seemed dead. Over the radio, the agents always reported the same thing: negative for movement. Sweat dripped under their vests, even in the cold night air. Every additional minute increased the doubt. Were they about to save a child or bust the hideout of some random man? Some agents began to suspect it was a false alarm, another lead that would go cold before leading anywhere. But then a light came on inside. Someone was there. Miguel gave the order. The agents stormed the house in a synchronized manner. They broke down the front door and entered in tactical formation, shouting orders in Portuguese and English. The interior was dark, poorly ventilated, with a heavy smell of mold and something else, something sweetish, cloying, that Miguel couldn't immediately identify. His brain made the automatic association with scenes of decomposing bodies, but there were no flies here, nor typical heat of that kind of environment. It was a different kind of filth, a different kind of abandonment. In the main room, sitting in a worn-out chair, was a man. In his 30s, thin, unshaven, eyes wide with surprise and fear, but not the kind of fear of someone who's been cornered with a secret, but the raw fear of someone who doesn't understand what's happening. "Where is the child?" Miguel shouted in Portuguese, then in English. The man opened and closed his mouth twice before he could speak. "What child?" His voice came out thin, cracked. I don't have any child here." The agents searched the house. 2 rooms, a tiny kitchen, a bathroom. Mattresses on the floor, piles of clothes, empty food containers. Signs that someone was living there precariously, improvising. But no child. No sign of Sophie. Miguel felt his stomach sink. Not again. Not one more time. He returned to the living room and faced the man, who was now visibly trembling. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" The man swallowed hard, breathing with difficulty. "My name is Javier Ruiz. I'm from Seville. I've been here for a week. This house belongs to a friend. He let me stay. Well, I sort out some problems." "What kind of problems?" Javier hesitated. He looked around as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. "Debts. I owe money to the wrong people. I came here to hide for a while, that's all. I swear, I didn't kidnap anyone." Miguel looked at the car parked outside. "Is that Renault yours?" Javier shook his head quickly. "No, it's rented. I borrowed it from someone. I don't know who it originally belongs to." "Were you driving this car on the night of November 3rd, near the Algarve resort?" Javier's face turned pale. He opened his mouth, closed. It opened it again. He was clearly trying to decide whether to lie or tell the truth. I might have passed by there. I don't remember exactly. I was driving a lot, trying to get off the grid." Miguel stepped closer, his voice low, controlled, but filled with an intensity that made Javier shrink. Back in his chair. "That night, a 3-year-old child disappeared from that resort. A witness saw a man alone in a car like yours, stopped on a secondary road at 2 in the morning, fiddling with the trunk. Do you want to tell me what you were doing there?" Javier started to cry. It wasn't a cry of guilt. It was a cry of pure fear, from someone who realized he was being accused of something far bigger than he could handle. "I didn't kidnap anyone. I swear to God I didn't do anything. I stopped there because the car was having engine trouble. It started to overheat. I opened the trunk looking for water, anything to cool it down. It had nothing to do with any child. Miguel studied the man. He had seen criminals lie hundreds of times. He had learned to identify the signs. And Javier Ruiz didn't seem to be lying. He was terrified, yes, but he didn't seem to be hiding the crime of kidnapping. "Did they search the car?" Miguel asked one of the agents. "Yes. Trunk, seats, floor mats, glove compartment. Nothing related to a child, nothing suspicious. Clean. Too clean," Miguel thought. Like the car returned to the rental company days before, scrubbed down and sterile of any useful clue. Miguel swore under his breath. He felt frustration rising in his throat like bile. It was like chasing a shadow. Every time they thought they had reached something solid, the shape dissolved before their eyes. Javier Ruiz was taken in for formal interrogation. He would spend the next few hours being questioned, his background would be searched, and every move he made in the last 15 days would be verified. But deep down, Miguel already knew. That man didn't have Sophie. He was just another weak link in a chain of cruel coincidences. The anonymous tip had led to a dead end, or worse, or distraction. And while they were chasing Javier Ruiz, Sophie Harper's real kidnapper remained free, getting further away, with more time to erase their tracks. In the next block, the investigation takes a much darker turn. A new clue leads Miguel to an international crime network that goes far beyond the disappearance of a child, and for the first time he considers the possibility that Sophie was not chosen by chance. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss any detail of the darkest part of this story. An anonymous tip led Miguel Azevedo and his team to an isolated house in Faro, where they found Javier Ruiz, a frightened man fleeing from debts, who was driving a car similar to the one seen near the resort. But Sophie wasn't there. Once again, the lead died before leading anywhere. Or at least, that's what it seemed. While Javier Ruiz was being interrogated in Lisbon, something unexpected happened. In the forensic lab, one of the technicians was reviewing, almost out of routine, the photos of the Renault's interior. He had already glanced at those images a few times when something caught his attention. On the plastic panel covering the sound system, there were recent scratches. Thin, irregular, as if someone had hastily removed the piece and put it back without care. He enlarged the image, digitally adjusted the lighting, and confirmed. The piece didn't look like it had been touched at the factory. This was recent, very recent. The technician asked to search the car again, this time more carefully, and that's when they found it. Hidden behind the radio panel was a small flash drive, black, unbranded, the kind you buy at any electronics store. There were no fingerprints. Someone had taken the trouble to wipe it clean. It wasn't something forgotten. It was something hidden. And at that moment, Miguel still didn't know if it had been placed there to be found or to never see the light of day. Miguel received the news 2 hours later. His heart raced. Finally, something concrete. Something that couldn't be a coincidence. The flash drive was immediately taken to the cybercrime unit of the Judicial Police. In a room illuminated by monitors and cold light, the team worked with extreme care. That kind of device could contain digital traps, heavy encryption, or programs that would destroy the data at the slightest improper access. But that wasn't the case. The content was extracted without problems, and what they found inside completely changed the course of the investigation. There were files, many files, spreadsheets with names, dates, amounts in euros and dollars, photographs of children, dozens of them, perhaps more than 50, all between 2 and 6 years old, boys and girls of different nationalities. Some photos seemed to have been taken in public places, parks, beaches, airports. Others were clearly from enclosed environments, dark, poorly lit places, where the children looked at the camera with a mixture of confusion and fear. And among those photos was Sophie Harper, her face unmistakable. Blonde hair, blue eyes, wearing the same clothes she had on the night of her disappearance. But there was something different in her eyes, less sparkle, more weariness. The photo had been taken recently, perhaps days before, perhaps hours, before the operation in Faro. Miguel felt his blood run cold. This was no longer a hypothesis. It was a brutal confirmation. Someone had seen Sophie after the disappearance. Someone had been close enough to photograph her. Sophie was alive, or at least she was alive when that photo was taken. But where was she now? And what did that list mean? The cybercrime team began to analyze the photo's metadata and the patterns in the spreadsheets. It didn't take long for a sinister pattern to emerge. The spreadsheets were not records of ordinary business transactions. They were delivery logs. Instead of product descriptions, there were acronyms and codes. But the pattern was too clear to be a coincidence. Abbreviated children's names, dates of acquisition, dates of transfer, places of origin and destination, alongside values ranging from 15,000 to 80,000 euros per child. It was a human trafficking network, and it was not an amateur operation. This was big, professional, international. There were references to cities in Portugal, Spain, Morocco, France, Germany. There were code names, never real names. There were maritime and land routes. There was a complex logistics planned with military precision. Miguel read the documents in silence, feeling a growing nausea in his stomach. He had seen a lot in his career: homicides, violent robberies, crimes of passion. But this was different. There were no explosions of anger, no uncontrolled impulses. There were organized columns, calculation formulas, dates, codes, cold calculated industrial, children being treated as merchandise. And Sophie Harper's name was in the middle of it all. One of a team of analysts, a young woman named Beatrice, pointed to the screen. "Inspector, look at this," she said. "There's a note next to Sophie's name. Premium client, express delivery, destination confirmed." Miguel moved closer to the screen, his heart tight. "Destination confirmed. What does that mean?" Beatrice hesitated, but answered with a firm, professional voice, trying not to let her emotion show. "It means she's already been sold, and that the delivery was or will be made without delay." The silence that followed was as heavy as lead. Miguel closed his eyes for a moment, trying to process. Sophie hadn't been taken on impulse. It wasn't a random kidnapping by an opportunistic pedophile. She had been chosen, probably, observed, perhaps for days, and then taken surgically as part of a larger operation. "How much time do we have?" Miguel asked, his voice hoarse. "If the spreadsheet is up to date," Beatrice scrolled the screen, checking the columns. "The delivery was scheduled for 5 days after the acquisition. That was 14 days ago." She took a deep breath before concluding, "Inspector, technically we're already past the deadline." Miguel felt his shoulders slump. It was like reading the exact time when someone had decided a child would change hands. No, it couldn't be too late. It couldn't. "Is there anything in the metadata? Any location, any server, anything that can lead us to who created these files?" Beatrice typed quickly, opening windows of code and technical analysis. "The files were sent and stored through the Tor network," she explained. "Impossible to trace the origin directly." She entered a few more commands, opened the metadata of one of the photos and frowned. "But there's something interesting here. One of Sophie's photos has a reflection in the glass behind her. It seems to be a window. Outside you can see part of a sign. It's blurry, but maybe we can enhance the image." Miguel leaned over the computer, his heart pounding. "Do it, now." Beatrice transferred the image to an enhancement software. She adjusted contrast, sharpness, zoom. The image was grainy, resistant to any attempt at perfect clarification. But, little by little, some letters began to appear on the screen. "Armazém Sá and Filhos. Transportes Marítimo." Miguel recognized the name immediately. He had seen Sá and Filhos on invoices seized in other financial investigations. It was a logistics company based in Porto, operating in several ports in southern Portugal and northern Africa. It wasn't a huge company, but it was big enough to move containers, dry cargo, transport goods for export, and apparently big enough to serve as a front for something much darker. "I need everything on this company," Miguel said, already picking up the phone. History, owners, employees, recent contracts, active routes, everything. While the team mobilized, Miguel left the room and called the operation coordinator in Lisbon. We need search warrants, several, and we need tactical support. This is no longer an isolated disappearance case. We're dealing with an international trafficking network, and Sophie Harper may be about to be sent out of the country if she's even still here. On the other end of the line, there was a pause. Then, the coordinator's firm voice. Understood. I'll mobilize whatever is necessary, but Miguel, if this is really what it seems, it won't just be the police. It will involve Interpol, Europol, maybe even authorities from other countries. This is going to escalate quickly. Miguel knew what that meant. Meetings, reports, formal authorizations, deadlines. Time. Let it escalate, Miguel replied, his jaw tight. But I'm not going to wait. For the bureaucracy. If there's a chance, however small, that Sophie is still in Portugal, I'm going after her. Now. He hung up and returned to the analysis room. Beatriz had already printed a map with the exact location of the San Filhos warehouse. It was in an industrial zone on the outskirts of Setúbal, about 40 minutes from Lisbon. An area full of metal sheds, loading docks, trucks parked in silent rows. The kind of place where a container can sit for days without being inspected. The kind of place where a child can disappear forever. Miguel gathered his team. This time, it wasn't going to be a discreet operation. This time they were going in with everything they had, because this time they had more than just shadows. They had an address, and maybe, just maybe, they still had time. In the next block, Miguel and his team raid the San Filhos warehouse. What they find inside goes beyond anything they imagined, and the truth about Sophie Harper's fate finally begins to be revealed. Subscribe and hit the bell. The final stretch is coming. The operation was mounted in less than 3 hours. Miguel Azevedo coordinated everything personally. 2 tactical teams from the Judicial Police, 4 patrol cars, search and seizure warrants signed by a judge on duty who understood the urgency of the case. There was no time for perfect planning. There was no time to wait for international reinforcements. Sophie Harper was somewhere, and every minute could be the last. The convoy left Lisbon at dusk, cutting through the highway towards Setúbal. Miguel was in the front seat of the first car, in silence, watching the road disappear under the headlights. Beside him, Agent Gonzalo reviewed the details of the operation. The warehouse is registered in the name of San Filhos Ilda, a company founded in 1998 specializing in maritime and land logistics. No known criminal record. But in the last 2 years, the company has changed hands 3 times, always to offshore companies. Miguel pressed his lips together. Classic, legitimate companies being used as a front. And the current owner? Armando Sá. 62 years old, no official record, but Interpol has an informal file on him. Suspicions of smuggling in the 90s. 40 minutes later, the convoy stopped about 200 meters from the warehouse. The lights were turned off. The teams got out in silence, adjusting bulletproof vests, helmets, radios. Ahead of them, the warehouse rose like a metal shadow against the dark sky. 3 stories high, corrugated steel gates, dirty windows covered with bars. There were 2 trucks parked outside, but no sign of movement. It looked abandoned. But Miguel knew that appearances were deceiving. The teams split up. One group surrounded the back, another positioned themselves on the sides. Miguel and Gonzalo advanced from the front. When they reached the main gate, Miguel knocked 3 times, hard. Judicial Police, we have a search warrant. Open the door. Silence. Miguel signaled to one of the agents who approached with a crowbar. A sharp blow. The padlock sprang open. The gate groaned as it was opened, and then they entered. The inside of the warehouse was vast and gloomy. The light from the flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing piles of wooden boxes, stacked pallets, rusty metal shelves. It smelled of diesel oil, mold, and something else, something acrid, chemical. Miguel advanced slowly, his weapon drawn. In the background, he heard a noise, a scraping of metal. He made a signal. The team spread out. In the center of the warehouse, There was an area isolated by plywood partitions, a kind of improvised office. The door was ajar. Miguel pushed it open with his foot. Inside, sitting behind a dirty desk, was a man with graying hair, a wrinkled face and small eyes. He didn't move. He just sat there, his hands on the desk as if were waiting. "Armando, sa?" Miguel asked. The man nodded slowly. "You're under arrest. Human trafficking, kidnapping, criminal association. Stand up slowly and put your hands behind your head." Armando obeyed, but there was something in his eyes. It wasn't fear. It was resignation. While Gonzalo handcuffed the man, Miguel looked around the office. Scattered papers, an old laptop, nautical charts, and in the corner, a coffee maker still on. The coffee was hot. Someone had been there recently. "Where are the children?" Miguel asked, his voice as hard as steel. Armando didn't answer. Miguel took a step forward, his face inches from his. "Where are the children?" Silence. Miguel took a deep breath, controlling his anger. He left the office and shouted to the team, "Search everything, every box, every container, every corner of this place, now!" And that's when one of the agents shouted from the back of the warehouse, "Inspector, over here!" Miguel ran. In the farthest corner of the shed, hidden behind a pile of empty containers, there was a metal staircase that went down to a lower level. Miguel descended the steps, his heart pounding in his chest. The flashlight beam revealed a narrow, damp corridor with concrete walls. There were doors on both sides, metal doors locked from the outside. He approached the first one. He unlocked it. He pushed the door open. Inside, on the floor covered by a thin, dirty mattress, were 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, between 3 and 5 years old. Torn clothes, dirty faces, wide eyes full of fear. Miguel felt his chest tighten. "It's okay," he said, lowering his weapon and kneeling down slowly. "It's okay now. You're safe. We're the police." The children didn't move. They just looked at him, not understanding. Gonzalo entered. Right behind him, his face tense. My God, Miguel ran to the next door. He opened it. 2 more children, then another and another. In total, they found 10 children in that basement. Different ages, different nationalities. Some were crying softly. Others were silent, their eyes empty. And then, in the last room, the smallest of all, Miguel opened the door. She was sitting in the corner, hugging her knees, her brown hair falling over her face. Thin, scared, but alive. Sophie Harper. Miguel felt his legs go weak. He entered slowly, crouching at a distance, taking off his helmet to seem less threatening. "Sophie," he said softly in English, "my name is Miguel. I'm a police officer. Your parents sent me to find you." She lifted her face. Her green eyes were swollen from crying, but there was still life in them. There was still hope. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice trembling. Miguel smiled, his eyes moist. "Yes, your mum and dad are waiting for you. They never stopped looking. And now, we're going to take you home." Sophie started to cry. Not from fear, from relief, from exhaustion, from everything. Miguel held out his hand. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she placed her small hand in his. He picked her up, wrapping her in his bulletproof vest as if it were a blanket, and carried her up the stairs. 3 hours later, at the Lisbon airport, David and Emma Harper ran down the stairs of the plane chartered by the British Embassy. They didn't wait for luggage. They didn't wait for anything. When they saw Sophie wrapped in a thermal blanket, sitting next to Miguel in the airport's VIP lounge, Emma let out a choked cry and ran. David was right behind her. Sophie stood up, trembling, and ran too. The reunion was a collision of arms, tears, and sobs. Emma held her daughter as if she would never let go. David kissed the top of her head repeatedly, his shoulders shaking with sobs. Miguel stood a little way off, watching. Gonzalo was beside him, also in silence. After long minutes, David approached Miguel. His eyes were red, but he was smiling. "Inspector Azevedo," he began, but his voice broke. Miguel held out his hand. David gripped it tightly and pulled Miguel into a tight hug. "Thank you," David whispered. "Thank you for bringing our daughter back." Miguel nodded, unable to speak. He just nodded. Emma also approached, holding Sophie's hand. She looked at Miguel and said, her voice choked with emotion, "You saved her life. You saved our lives." Miguel swallowed hard. "I was just doing my job," he said. "But I'm glad she's safe. That's all that matters." Sophie looked at Miguel. She let go of her mother's hand for a moment and came closer. Then she raised her arms. Miguel knelt. She hugged him. "Obrigada," she whispered in Portuguese, the word pronounced with difficulty, but full of meaning. Miguel smiled, his eyes finally overflowing. "You're welcome, Sophie. You're welcome." Epilogue. Armando Sá was sentenced to 25 years in prison. 7 other members of the network were arrested in the following weeks, including the photographer and 2 recruiters in London and Paris. The 10 rescued children were reunited with their families or placed under the protection of specialized services. All received psychological counseling and comprehensive support. Sophie Harper returned to London. It took months of therapy, but gradually she began to smile again. She started playing again. She became a child again. David and Emma Harper sent a letter to Miguel Azevedo every year on the anniversary of the rescue. In the first, there, was a photo of Sophie blowing out the candles on a cake. In the last, she was dressed in a school uniform, smiling, holding a swimming trophy. Miguel kept all the letters in a desk drawer, and sometimes, when the days were long and the investigations heavy, he would open that drawer and read them. Because those letters reminded him of one thing. Not all cases end in tragedy. Sometimes, just sometimes, good wins, and a life is saved. And that, Miguel thought, was enough.